Chapter 21 of Blacker Chief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Blacker Chief Dick by Margery Allingham. Chapter 21. Ho there, you mange-struck dogs. Broach a keg and drink to your captain's lady. Blacker Chief Dick, his eyes flashing and his face showing bright and triumphant in the flickering lantern light, shouted the words over the side of Ben's boat to a little knot of picked men of the Annie's crew who were ranged on the sand below. They were present to witness their captain's marriage to Annie Farren, and incidentally to carry the rum which was the price of his bride. The worn deck of the Pet had been cleaned and partially cleared for the occasion. Dick had insisted on this, and in spite of the protestations of the two old people, Ben and Pet, the work had been done, and the place presented a fairly tidy aspect. The empty kegs were ranged in neat rows round the gunwale. The clothesline had been removed, and the rest of the litter swept down the hatchway. It was almost dark, and the cloudless sky was a pale blue, shading off to rose and green in the west, where the first 2 or 3 stars shone faintly. On deck a big ship's lantern stood on the stump of the main mast, while 2 smaller ones hung on each side of it. They showed sick and yellow in the half-light. Standing before this improvised altar was a man dressed as a priest. He held a book in his hand and was mumbling to himself nervously in a foreign tongue. On either side of him were Blue Neck and Noah Goody. Their knives were drawn and their faces set like wooden masks. Before them, in a gorgeous, ill-fitting gown of yellow lion silk, which Dick had brought and insisted on her wearing, stood Annie. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes dancing with excitement. Round her neck hung a great silver pendant studded with garnets, and every now and then her hand would stray up to this, and her fingers caress it lovingly, half wonderingly. On the little brown hand shone a ring. It was an extraordinary jewel, consisting of a little gold hoop supporting a large flower, each petal of which was a different kind of stone: diamond, ruby, emerald, onyx, pearl, and sapphire, with a little piece of amber for the center. Dick had told her that it was very old when he had put it on her finger, and she looked at it with something very like awe. Behind her stood Ben and Pet. The old man swayed to and fro drunkenly, taking little or no interest in the proceedings, but the old woman watched eagerly, half enviously. Her bleary-eyed eyes followed Annie's every movement and each gleam of the jewels, her quick ears catching each word that was spoken. Nothing escaped her, and she noticed that the priest's garments were made for a much larger man, and that his book was upside down. But she said nothing, and merely smiled wickedly to herself as the ceremony went on. The men on the beach below were not long in obeying their captain's order, and in a minute the toast was given. "Health and good fortune to the captain's lady." Everybody drank heartily, the priest more than anyone, and Dick, his brocaded coat and soft lace ruffles shining in the dim light, and his black curls showing a little more than usual from under his black kerchief, raised his glass above his head, and taking Annie by the hand, threw back his head and laughed joyously. He had once again got his own way in spite of difficulties. He drained off his liquor, and throwing the empty glass over his head, began to sing. Fair as the island, and proud as the sea, as naught in the world is sweet Annie to me. The rich musical voice echoed round the old boat and floated out over the marshes. Annie caught her breath, and her grip on the Spaniard's pulsing white hand tightened. She was carried out of herself by the excitement of the moment, the wonderful frock, the jewels, and above all the singing. Dick felt her emotion, and his arm slid round her waist, much like a snake slips round a tree stem. And as her pretty head fell back on his shoulder, the song grew louder, sweeter, and a triumphant note crept into it. So gentle, so tender, so wise without guile, oh, where is another like Anne of the Isle? Annie sighed deliriously, and she shivered with pure excitement. The Spaniard's full red lips brushed her hair before the wonderful voice rang out again in the chorus. Anne, oh, Anne of the island, where is another like Anne of the Isle? The crew took up the strain, and Dick and Annie stood together in a circle of singing men, each with his rumkin held high above his head, and his foot keeping time to the rhythm. Old Pet spat on the deck, and an envious light came into her evil old face. All her life she had longed to be the centre of a scene like this, the magnet of an admiring crowd of hard-drinking, hard-fighting, hard-loving men. All her life had been spent in dreams of a night like this. Now, in her age, it was bitter to see it come to another woman. As for Annie, she was intoxicated with it all. Any sense of prudence had left her. She was supremely happy. Now and again a faint regret that she could not marry Hal rose in her mind, but she dismissed it promptly. The future had no being for her, and the past was a dream. The thing that counted was the present, the laughing, pulsing, living present. And as the Annie's crew roared out their captain's own love song, and Dick, his Spanish blood on fire with love triumphant, kissed her hair, her eyes and mouth, she laughed as freely and as joyously as he had done. The shadows were deepening by this time, and the deep blue sky was studded with stars, and Annie, looking up from the captain's shoulder, said suddenly, "It is late, sir. I must go back to the ship now." Dick looked at her in astonishment for a moment, and a contemptuous, cackling laugh broke out from between Pet Salt's thin, blackened lips. At the sound of it, Annie shuddered involuntarily and drew a little closer to the Spaniard, who, noting her agitation, turned on the old woman angrily, his eyes suddenly losing their dreamy love-heaviness and becoming hard and bright. "Peace, hag," he rapped out. "Get thee down thy rat-hole, and take thy sodden man with thee, or nothing shall you see of me or my cargoes from this night on." Pet began to mumble and curse under her breath, but nevertheless she obediently hobbled across the deck toward the hatchway, half carrying, half dragging the drunken Ben along with her. The company watched them in silence, and Annie, as with fascinated eyes, she followed them to the dark hole down which they disappeared, could not help being reminded of one big muddy crab dragging its prey after it into its noisome hole, there to feast. Dick, too, watched them and shrugged his shoulders. "So may all evil creatures drag themselves out of thy path, my Anne of the Island," he said, and then, as though a new idea had struck him, "Thou art right, dear heart. Get thee back to the ship. That will be the best way. and then I will come for thee. Until then, say nothing of this." Annie smiled happily, and ran to the hatchway to change her frock again, and as she laid by the soft silk, she felt in her childish, happy-go-lucky way that she had laid by the whole evening's business with it. She had been half afraid that Dick would not let her go back to the ship. Now it seemed that he wanted her to. She had some sort of vague idea that she was to be his wife on the island only, when she would see him in the ordinary way at the ship. She sighed relievedly. The matter did not seem to be as important as she had imagined. When she came on the deck again, dressed in her usual kirtle and bodice, the crew were rolling several unopened kegs onto the deck, and the priest was helping them. But Annie did not notice this, for Dick was waiting for her. "I will go with thee along the way," he said gallantly, his soft eyes seeking hers, and his slim white hand closing on her little brown one. Annie smiled at him, and he helped her down the rope ladder and onto the beach. Once again his silk-sleeved arms slid round her, and she laid her head on his shoulder. They walked on in silence. Suddenly the Spaniard stopped, and his other arm encircled her, pulling back her head and raising her little white face to his. Annie could see him strangely earnest and grave in the moonlight. "You are my first love, Anne of the Island, though there be many others I have sported with," he said in a strangely quiet, even voice, "and I am a strange man. Take care how you use me." Annie looked at him with frank, innocent eyes. He was very handsome, she thought. "I pray you kiss me, sir," she said softly. They did not move for a second or so, and the wind rose over the sea and whistled through the long grass at the sides of the path, and rustled the seaweed at their feet. Suddenly they became aware that someone was coming toward them. Annie grew suddenly rigid. It was a step she knew. Dick looked up quickly, and they began to walk on. The figure came nearer and nearer. Dick strained his eyes to see who it was, but the man was in the shadow, and he passed without speaking. When they had gone on a little way, Dick paused. "Didst see who 'twas passed us, Anne?" he asked. Annie swallowed, and then said as carelessly as she could, "Oh, 'twas no one of any account. 'Twas the tapster from the ship." End of chapter 21. Recording by John Brandon.